Welcome to Lesson 7 of our Cultural Diversity Training. My name is Desiree Cochran-Norfolk. This lesson is about social class and classism. And so this lesson is going to take us into one of the most often overlooked yet deeply influential aspects of identity, which is social class. Unlike race or gender or sexuality, which are often visible, class is sometimes hidden, sometimes it's assumed, and sometimes it's misrepresented. But it shapes our lives really profoundly, like where we're living, how we're speaking, our access to healthcare, the schools that we attend, and even the clothes on our back. So in counseling, ignoring class issues can mean missing the very heart of a client's struggle. Our goal is to kind of peel back the layers of how class is impacting mental health and relationships and opportunities and identity development, and to kind of equip you with some tools to address classism compassionately and effectively in every session. So when we talk about social class, I need you to know what we're meaning here. It can be measured and described in many ways: income, job status, wealth, housing, clothing, education, even peer groups. So, for example, consider how people may be labeled differently if they rent versus owning a home, or if they have blue collar versus white collar jobs, or they went to community college versus an Ivy League school. But beyond those indicators, class is also about perception. So how people see themselves and how society sees them. A person may live paycheck to paycheck but identify as middle class because they have a steady job. Another may be wealthy but feel ashamed of the privilege because of guilt or disconnection from their community. And we also need to reflect on human rights here. Article 25 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights reminds us that everybody has the right to a standard of living that's adequate for health and well-being, including food and housing and care. So as counselors, it's kind of challenging us to ask, do we see access to resources as a human right or as something earned? And how do those beliefs shape the way that we respond to clients in poverty? This is not an abstract theory. Imagine working with a client who's skipping sessions because they can't afford transportation, or even the sessions themselves, or a teenager who's ashamed to invite friends over because their family lives in public housing. These are clinical issues. They're not just life circumstances. So understanding class indicators allows us to meet clients where they are without judgment. So I want you to look in your handouts, exploring your class story. And I want you to answer the prompts about work, education, income, home, space, clothing, recreation, and health from your upbringing. Just take 10 minutes to write your own class story. Think about your parents' work, your schooling, your home environment, and what messages you received about money and opportunity. And notice the emotions that are surfacing here. It's going to help you reflect and deepen your awareness of your own worldview. But social classifications are common, if not universal, to human societies. These classifications are used to assign social roles like production, protection, child rearing, spiritual stewardship. And these classifications may be based on gender, race, age, ethnicity, ability, their knowledge, or their education. So frequently, these classifications become a way of designating rank and power or their social class status. And in some societies, social class may take a formal structure, like a caste system, like in India, or like a traditional social class structure, like in England. And in these instances, people are born into a social class that defines their community, their vocation, their education, their language, and also their behavior towards others, either within or outside of their own social classification. And although the United States may not have a formal class structure, our economic and political and legal and educational and even the social institutions are effectively grouping people according to their access to and ability to manipulate those socioeconomic resources. And those resources or those class indicators are going to be their income, their job status, their wealth, their housing, their clothing, their education, and their peer groups. And there's a lot of different ways of conceptualizing and discussing social class structure, But one way is based on comparing quantifiable socioeconomic factors like educational attainment or the type of employment, the income level, their savings, their investment, their housing, their property ownership. Another way of conceptualizing class is subjectively. So in other words, how do individuals perceive and experience their own socioeconomic status in relation to others? Yet other perspectives examine the complex interactions between the economics and the gender and the race. Class is also defined in terms of access to and ability to wield power and influence. And there's some terms that we could use, low income, middle income, upper income, low class, middle class, upper class, working poor, working class, wealthy, welfare recipient, homeowner, or college graduate, or we could say like high school dropout, high school graduate, executive, or manual labor, skilled labor, elite. And although these terms are generally accepted, many of them are used to kind of covertly reference and perpetuate negative stereotypes. So in considering those terms, think about what images come to mind. Why do certain profiles like race or gender or occupation get associated with those specific terms? What is the source of those associations? So when we talk about socioeconomic status, it's generally going to refer to like comparative measures of class standing or status that's based upon a combination of like educational attainment, income level, and occupational prestige. We have other class indicators kind of considering in the assessment of socioeconomic status, depending on the issue being explored there. Like maybe you wish to include peer group status when assessing an adolescent client. So in the field of counseling, socioeconomic status is often used as a descriptor for clients or for research sample populations, like saying a low SES client is assumed to have no more than a high school diploma and to be working in a low skilled position, probably for minimum wage. And then on the other end of the continuum, a high SES client is assumed to have a college degree, working in a salaried professional career with benefits, and also to have acquired assets like property ownership, investments, things like that. So an example of a middle or a moderate SES individual would be like a recent graduate of a master's level counseling program who may be income poor, especially if they're graduating with student loans. But education rich, like under 10% of the population has attained a graduate level degree in the US. So it's important for us to understand the interaction between the social, the educational, and the economic factors in perceiving the socioeconomic status. We have low, middle, or high SES, and that doesn't automatically correlate with income level. Poverty is a condition in which a person's unable to meet basic requirements for well-being, like food, shelter, clothing. And wealth, on the other hand, is indicating a surplus of resources. So a person who is wealthy is able to meet their basic needs and accumulate resources to satisfy their wants. And so while it is possible to move between wealth and poverty, like, think about gambling or stock market investing, inheritances, and so on, a lot of people are going to remain at roughly the same income level as their parents. So the concrete results of inequitable resource distribution are obvious here, like hunger, homelessness, educational limitations, or maybe difficulty obtaining insurance. But the less apparent are the ways in which, class bias and SES is going to influence you and your client. Prejudice, thinking about both positive and the negative biases that are based on socioeconomic status, is going to influence mental health and the counseling process on multiple levels. And that's going to include the presenting of concerns, the therapeutic relationship, our case conceptualizations, and also what intervention choices we choose and what access those clients have to services. So let's jump into classism. In its simplest form, classism is having discriminatory beliefs about and behavior toward individuals and groups based on their perceived or their actual socioeconomic status. So from childhood, we are exposed to constant messages of family, friends, teachers, and the media about relative class status. And these familial or social biases are going to shape our sense of self, our relationship, and our worldview. So when our beliefs or values or decisions and relationships are based on perceptions of respective class status, it's going to be known as internalized classism. Looking inward, we might feel shame or accomplishment or superiority depending on our perceived social class position. And looking outward, we may resent or blame or admire others, you know, based on their comparative socioeconomic status. So as counselors, we need to understand how internalized and structural classism is social and institutional practices that discriminate based on socioeconomic status. So as counselors, we need to understand how that internalized structural classism affects the mental health and the counseling process. And although the counseling profession has made significant progress in addressing issues of gender and race and ethnicity and sexual identity, classism is rarely addressed. Two factors that may contribute to this relative silence are psychological distancing and poverty attribution. Psychological distancing refers to ways of thinking and behaving that are used by privileged groups to justify and distance themselves from their role in socioeconomic injustices. And one way of distancing is to structure education, work, and spiritual and community activities in a way that maintains the separation between those socioeconomic classes. And that separation prevents the development of empathy that would naturally follow from open communication and close relationships. Another factor that's going to interfere with actively addressing the consequences of classism is poverty attribution. And that's how individuals explain poverty. Studies of both the economically privileged and the marginalized groups have found that race, gender, political, and religious affiliation influence the people's beliefs regarding individual wealth or poverty. And one belief is that resources are gained or lost due to individual causation. So people are poor or wealthy because of their personal values, their work ethic, or other personal characteristics. And people are personally responsible for their economic status. Another belief is that individual wealth or poverty is best explained by socioeconomic and political factors or structural causation. Like, for example, here, people are poor because of discriminatory social policy or oppression or other institutional forms of exclusion. And that was done by Hunt in 2004. And Hunt found that most of the participants attributed wealth to individual accomplishment and attributed poverty to external factors such as failing economies, politics, discrimination, and so on. And that same study found that racial and ethnic minorities were more likely than whites to attribute both wealth and poverty to external factors such as privilege and oppression. So the way that we learn to understand and explain relative wealth and privilege and oppression is really influenced by our life experiences and our acquired values and the ways in which we relate to other people and them to us. So as counselors, we have to hold up a mirror. Are we subtly reinforcing classist assumptions in the language that we're using, in the expectations that we're setting? Do we unintentionally shame clients for not being able to follow through when in reality they don't have childcare or bus fare? Awareness of classism is really going to help us reduce the harm and increase the empathy for our clients. Despite historical evidence to the contrary, much of the cultural mythology of the United States is rooted in the belief that this is a classless society with equal opportunity for all. The so-called quote unquote American dream. The predominant cultural belief is that if you work hard, you're going to get ahead, and conversely, if you're not getting ahead, it's because you're not working hard enough. And failing to examine and challenge this myth is going to serve to maintain that status quo and perpetuate the conditions that really just continue to undermine the well-being of people and families and communities across the class levels. White Europeans who colonized North America brought class structure with them in the form of indentured servants and enslaved peoples, and created a political system that favored the dominant social class, which was the white European Christian male property owners. So remnants of that system of controlling social participation and thus power have lingered even to today. The wealthiest in the nation are predominantly white and male. The poorest are disproportionately women and children and racial and ethnic minorities. And not only do we have identifiable class structure, but the income gap between the rich and the poor in the US is wider than in most other developed nations. Of the top 20 nations in the world for promoting human development, the US ranks 16th. And furthermore, among those top 20 nations, the United States has one of the lowest life expectancies, and was in the bottom 3 for functional literacy rates, and had the highest population percentage with incomes below the national median. Classism plays a central role in resource distribution and access to power in the United States. The degree to which individuals can move between class levels in a society is referred to class mobility. And in the United States, a lot of people continue to believe that there is a high degree of class mobility and that people can move freely between the socioeconomic levels within one lifespan or over generations. However, actual statistics on income and employment and education and health indicate otherwise. The communities that we live in, the schools that we attend, whether or not we attend and complete college, our career opportunities and our social networks, those are largely predicated by the socioeconomic class of our families of origin. So thinking about the US class structure, 2% of the world's population owns more than half of all global wealth, while half of the world's population owns only 1% of all wealth. 1/3 of the world's wealth is owned by North Americans, and that's home to the richest 1% of the global population. Wealth is concentrated even further within that 1%. According to records with the IRS in 2001, 3.5% of the adult population in this country held an estimated 32.7% of the US net worth. So between 1998 and 2000, or in the year 2000, Americans with a net worth of 5 million or more saw their upholdings increase by over 40%. And since 1977, the number of tax returns reporting incomes over 200,000 has on average increased, with 2005 being the largest single year increase since 1978. The old saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it takes money to make money, appear to hold true. And in an analysis of US Census data in 2007, Albrecht found that low socioeconomic status individuals fared worse living in economically advantaged communities as opposed to the economically similar neighborhoods. Stagnating wages and the scarcity of affordable housing are two of the many factors that contribute to entrenched economic injustices. And of people aged 16 and older who are at or below the poverty line, almost 12% are full-time year-round workers. So as counselors, we must remember that class shapes not just access to resources, but also mental health outcomes. Research is going to show that the people who are lower socioeconomic status, they are living in wealthy neighborhoods, and they're gonna fare worse mentally than those in the communities of similar economic status. And that's due to the constant comparison and the stigma. So the question becomes, how do we challenge the myths of a classless society while helping clients hold hope for change? This is where advocacy is going to meet counseling. We're going to support our clients in navigating systemic barriers while also pushing back against the larger structures that keep inequality in place. So our respective class status and corresponding ability to access basic resources interact with our mental health on several levels. Poverty has been associated with higher incidence of mental health disorders, more severe symptoms, and also a greater difficulty accessing services. Poverty is also associated with greater incidence of exposure to violence and related trauma, also depression, anxiety, PTSD. And so that's especially true for women and children. One study found that a majority of women receiving welfare had a history of domestic violence, and 1/3 experienced ongoing abuse. And that was from a study done by Josephson in 2005. So children from impoverished families and communities have higher exposure to pollutants in the air and water and food. The daycares and the schools in the low-income neighborhoods are inferior and often toxic, and children have less access to books and computers and other tools for learning. So it's been hypothesized that mental illnesses may precipitate a downward slide into poverty due to difficulty managing basic life tasks. But recent evidence indicates that poverty is just as likely to precede the development of mental illness, in part due to that pervasive and unrelenting life stressors. And because of the direct negative correlations between the poverty and the well-being, it's going to be important to know more about who is poor and to understand the risk factors and the mental health consequences associated with the poverty. And it's also going to be important for us to understand the relationship between poverty, identity, and well-being. So let's talk about who is poor, because poverty is not just about money, it's about chronic stress. So the national poverty rate between 2023 and 2024 puts the official U.S. poverty rate at 10.6%, with about 35.9 million people in poverty. And the U.S. poverty threshold is the income level that the Census Bureau uses to determine who is considered poor. And it's going to vary by household size and composition. So in 2024, the official census threshold for a single person under 65 was $16,800, which is a little bit up from 2005, where it was about $15,720. If you are a single person 65 and older, that threshold goes down a little bit to $15,500. If you have two adults under 65 with two children, that's about $31,200. If it's two adults, one who is over 65 with two children, that's about $30,500. Four-person household with two adults, two kids is about $31,200. A six-person household with two adults and four children is about $44,200. And these thresholds are nationwide, but they're not the same as the federal poverty guidelines, which are issued by HHS and used for program eligibility like Medicaid, SNAP, or Head Start. Those are going to be different numbers. So as of 2023, non-Hispanic white people is about 7.7% under federal poverty guidelines. For Black or African Americans, it's 17 to 18.4%. Hispanic or Latino of any race is about 15%, and Asian culture is low. It's around 7%, depending on the measure. It's significantly below the national average. So as you can see, this indicates significant economic disparities for racial and ethnic minorities. And if we're looking at women and children, overall, about 13.9% of women in the U.S. live below the poverty line. And so if we look specifically at the different races, for women, for Black women, it's 19.9%. American Indian or Alaska Native women is 19.3%. Hispanic women is 17.7%. It's 11% of white women and 9.5% of Asian women. When we're looking at children under the age of 18, poverty rates are higher than for adults, and they show sharp racial ethnic inequalities. So under the official measure, children's poverty in recent years, like 2023, is about 15.3%. If we look at the different racial backgrounds for children, for Black children, it's 17 to 20%, depending on the measure, and it's even higher in some sources. 19 to 21% for Hispanic children, 11 to 12% of white children, and 9 to 11% on Asian children. And that's going to vary by subgroup. And that's really significant because children under the age of 18 make up about 21.5% of the US population, but about 16% of children are living in poverty. So that's roughly about 11.4 million children. So that's roughly about 1 in every 6 children in the US live in poverty. The poverty rate among Black and Latino children is 3 times of white children. So many of the risk factors associated with poverty are related to challenges meeting basic resource needs. And basic resources necessary for security and well-being are going to include sufficient and nutritious food, education, employment with living wages, safe and stable housing, healthcare and childcare. Counselors with a basic working knowledge of inequalities and stressors in those areas are going to be better prepared to discuss and assess those issues with their clients. So the U.S. government uses the term food insecurity to refer to limited or uncertain food availability. And in 2023, about 13.5% of U.S. households were food insecure at some time during the year. That's about 18 million households. And of those, 5.1% of U.S. households, which is about 6.8 million, experienced very low food security, meaning the eating patterns of one or more people in the household were disrupted and food intake was reduced because they couldn't afford enough food. And clearly those numbers are going to be skewed based upon race as well. Food scarcity has been linked with obesity because they have difficulty accessing fresh and healthy foods. It's also linked to depression. And, there's a linkage with incidents of major depression in female welfare recipients. So a child who goes to bed hungry may struggle with focus or behavior or relationships in school. A parent who is unable to afford safe housing may live with constant fear of eviction, and that fear is going to seep into the family dynamics. So in counseling, we have to widen our lens. Is a client's depression really treatment resistant, or are they just living under conditions that would make anyone feel hopeless? We really need to be creative here, helping clients problem solve around access, connecting them with resources, validating their struggles, that letting them know, like, hey, this is not just simply a personal failing on your part. So a significant factor in public education inequity is the means by which public schools are funded. And there are currently no federal standards for fundings. States determine allocations, which are generally a combination of local and federal and state resources. And the majority of the funding in most states has been generated from local property taxes, which is then allocated locally, like a town's property taxes would fund the town school. But properties in middle and upper income areas generate significantly higher property taxes than those in the low income areas and the poor areas. And that's going to contribute to profound inequities in school facilities, teacher salaries, teaching materials, and so on. So one of the first legal challenges to the system of funding was California's Serrano v. Priest in 1971. And that was filed on behalf of poor students and demanded a more equitable system of taxation and allocation. And since then, more than 40 states have been subject to court cases challenging the constitutionality of their system of public school funding. Increasingly, states are being held accountable for ensuring that, all children have access to adequate education. And recent data from the U.S. Department of Education indicates that per student expenditure for students in districts with high poverty has achieved some equity with low poverty districts. But expenditures in middle districts, like moderate poverty areas, are frequently anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 less per student. So funding disparities in public schools are exacerbated by the family socioeconomic status and the access to resources. About half of students from the wealthiest families are going to attend colleges, and these families are going to spend an average of about 7% of their income on the child's college education. And only about 1 out of 17 students from the poorest families will get into college, and their families are going to spend about 25% of their household incomes on that college education. So those that do make it into college face reduced availability of the federal grant assistance, higher interest rates on student loans, exorbitant textbook costs, and then we have the challenges of balancing work and academics. So students from poor and low income backgrounds have significantly lower college graduation rates than those from higher socioeconomic statuses. And oftentimes a lack of financial resources may impact graduate school or professional degrees. So then we move into employment. Educational attainment and employment opportunities are closely linked here in perpetuating those generational class oppressions. So the lower the education level, the more likely an individual is to be employed at a minimum wage hourly job. And while housing and food and utility and clothing and transportation costs have steadily increased, the wages have remained stagnant. And a lot of people in this country have experienced increasing difficulty maintaining their lifestyle in the world population. Few people have adequate living conditions. So in May of 2007, Congress approved a bill to increase the federal minimum wage for the first time since 1997. And the minimum wage was increased from $5.15 to $5.85 per hour, and then gradually increased to $7.25 an hour by 2009. So an individual working a 40-hour week every week of the year at federal minimum wage in 2007, and beyond that, they earn $12,168 annually then. But now at $7.25 an hour, it's bumped up to $15,080 per year, and that's before taxes. So consider that the federal poverty threshold for one person is 16,800, and even if you worked a full-time job, you still would be under the federal poverty wage. So it's easy to see why many states have already substantially increased their minimum wage and why there's a growing movement advocating for the creation of a living wage. So the campaign for a living wage is grounded in the belief that no one who is working full time should be living in poverty, and that work should be adequately rewarded. So some living wage campaigns have succeeded in securing hourly wages at $9.50 per hour, and some have increased that to $15 per hour in cities and towns and at large employers across the country. You can do some living wage campaign research on the Living Wage Resource Center at www.livingwagecampaign.org. But employment in general is becoming increasingly unstable. Wages have stagnated, health benefits are declining or disappearing, jobs are being outsourced, and rapidly shifting fields and technologies are requiring constant education and training. So the employment rate does not really include people who have already exceeded the benefits period without obtaining work, nor does it include those who have become dissatisfied with job programs that funneled them into minimum wage employments, nor those who are working part-time or temporary jobs. But it only takes one illness in the family, or one job loss to fall from unemployed to underemployed to unemployed to social welfare. Women are especially vulnerable due to the continuing gender inequity in wages, and limited employment options that are suitable for moms who are primary caretakers, and the difficulty of finding safe and affordable childcare. I mean, one child can cost $600 a month, or more. So imagine if you have two children that need childcare, that can be $1,200 a month for a family of just two children. Welfare limitations on lifetime enrollment have been successful in reducing the welfare roll, but results indicate that these reforms have really succeeded by cutting off access and not really reducing the poverty. So TANF, the Temporary Aid to Needy Families, welfare eligibility and work requirements have been revised in such a way that less than half of the poor families receive assistance, and those who access the benefits may never fully acquire or regain economic stability. And this and other aspects of employment instability have been found to contribute to anxiety and depression. And then conversely, improvements in economic well-being have been found to have positive outcomes for psychological well-being. And if we think about the Back to Work program that Georgia DFACS requires for people, they require you to work at least a minimum of 20 hours per week, and you have to maintain that employment. And so getting the employment even at a minimum wage would still keep you under the federal poverty guidelines. And even for someone that makes $15 an hour, if you have two kids, you're still under the federal poverty guidelines at $31,800. So you still would not be able to make ends meet. But if you make $31,801, you're getting no assistance. And if you make close to that, you're only getting like $100 a month or $50 a month or $200 a month, and that's just in food stamps. So it's not really helping these people to get out of poverty, and it's barely helping them to survive and feed their families. And then we have the safe and affordable housing. So the Fair Housing Act that was adopted in 1968 prohibits discrimination in housing rentals, sales, and mortgage lending on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. And this has not eliminated housing discrimination, but it's kind of provided an avenue for complaint and redress. So there's no such protection for class discrimination in housing. So steadily increasing housing costs coupled with the stagnating wages have created a serious shortage in safe and affordable housing for a lot of Americans. And across the country, public housing is being demolished and replaced by mixed income housing units that are in fact unaffordable for low income groups. Homeless shelters are seeing an increase in families seeking assistance. Nationwide, we see about 12.1 million renter households that spent more than 50% of their income on rent. That's about 26.5% of all renter households are spending more than half of their income on rent. And the national average for monthly rent and utilities for a two-bedroom apartment is approximately $1,800 to $2,000 per month, and that's for rent and basic utilities. So to earn sufficient income to cover the cost along with food and other necessities, a household has to have at least one wage earner earning full-time at an hourly wage of $24.50 per hour. If we break this down, rent and utilities about, let's just say a midpoint $1,900 per month. Food on a modest plan would run about $750 a month, and for the family of two or three, and that's very, very modest, like rice and beans and ramen noodles. Transportation, like car payment, insurance, gas, maintenance, roughly around $700 a month. Healthcare, if it was out of pocket, that'd be about $500 a month. Other necessities like clothing, phone, internet, school, household goods, etc., roughly around $400 a month. So your total estimated cost for just surviving In a 2-bedroom apartment, $4,250. And so over 12 months, you would need to make about $51,000 per year just to cover those basic needs. And so if we convert that to an hourly wage, working 40 hours a week for 52 weeks, that's $24.50 an hour, or $51,000 per year. And that would have to be pre-tax income of more than that. So despite the recent increase in the federal minimum wage to $7.25 an hour, it would be impossible for minimum wage workers to maintain housing at those costs, even with 2 wage earners working full time. And housing quality and community safety have been found to have positive correlations with mental health. So one study randomly moved families out of public housing in high poverty neighborhoods and into private housing in near poor or non-poor neighborhoods. And the findings indicated that among the families moved into the private housing, parental stress was significantly reduced, and the male children exhibited less anxious and depressive symptoms and fewer dependency problems. And let's jump into health insurance really quick. The U.S. is home to the greatest wealth in the world, yet remains one of the fewest developed nations without universal health care. So the people, according to the U.S. Census data, in around 2005, about 16% of people had no health insurance coverage. But that number has been reduced because of Obamacare and the other healthcare marketplace systems that are in place now. And so right now, as of 2024, there's about 7.9 to 8.2% of people in the US who are uninsured. And among adults 18 to 64, that number is about 11%. And children, it's about 4.9% are uninsured. And the uninsured rates do differ substantially for marginalized communities compared to the overall average. So for American Indian and Alaskan Natives, their uninsured rate is about 18.7%. For Hispanic Latinos, it's about 17.9%. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, it's about 12%. It's about 9.7% for Black or African Americans, and only 6.5% for white or non-Hispanics. So breaking that down, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, those marginalized racial ethnic groups tend to have significantly higher uninsured rates than white and non-Hispanic people. The highest rates are among American Indian and Alaskan Natives and the Hispanic people. And those gaps persist even after policies like the ACA or the Affordable Care Act, although those policies have helped reduce the disparities somewhat. In states that did not expand Medicaid under the ACA, the disparities tend to be larger for those groups. And classism has fatal consequences for children and adults for lower income levels, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities. And we know that the United States has one of the highest levels of per capita health expenditures, but the investment is not benefiting from economically marginalized. So this country has one of the highest rates of infant mortality among the developed industrialized nations. And child mortality in the general population has been measured at about 6.5 deaths per 1,000 births. But if we break it down by the different racial groups, overall it's 6.5 per 1,000 births, but for Black and African Americans, it's 10.9. And for American Indian and Alaskan Natives, it's 9.2. Hispanic of any race is a little bit lower at 5 out of 1,000. And for white non-Hispanics, it's 4.5. And for Asians or Pacific Islanders, it's only 3.7 to 3.4. And we know that overall life expectancy varies in direct relationship to income. Individuals with higher socioeconomic status can expect to gain an average of 10 to 15 years longer than those in the lower income brackets. For men, the gap is around 14 years, and for women, the gap is around 10 years. And education plays a similar role. College graduates are going to live on average about 7 to 9 years longer than those without a high school diploma. So housing and employment insecurity coupled with a lack of access to healthcare is going to trigger an irreversible decline in economic, physical, and mental health. And after interviewing individuals and families across the country and seeing firsthand the fate of the uninsured, Sared and Fernando Puli in 2005 referred to this decline as a death spiral. And without adequate health safeguards, jobs are lost due to illnesses, homes are lost due to job loss, and illness is aggravated by stress and anxiety and depression and exhaustion, attempting to just secure the basic needs. So, perceptions and identity. Let's talk about this for a second. Whereas economic status is clearly a powerful factor in overall wellness, it's going to appear that individual perceptions of socioeconomic status are going to play a role as well. The degree to which we are satisfied or dissatisfied with our status economically relative to others has been found to influence health outcomes. Classism and the stigma attached to lower socioeconomic status is going to contribute to feeling deprived and of power and place and voice. And the psychological consequences of feeling devalued and displaced may include humiliation or lowered efficacy or low self-esteem, higher rates of suicide. And the ability to externalize classism and identify structural causes and to be able to take effective action are going to contribute to positive stress coping and resiliency. So it's important for us to understand evolving perceptions of class and relationship between social class and mental health over time. So to address classism in counseling, we start with awareness. Where do my biases lie? Do I feel discomfort with clients who are wealthier or poorer than me? Do I expect clients to share my values about money or work or ambition? And we then build knowledge, understanding theories like the feminist theory, womanist theory, or the social class worldview model, and researching how class affects health seeking, stigma, and access to care. And then lastly, we practice skills. So conducting thorough assessments that are going to include the class factors, collaborating with clients to set some realistic goals, and advocating for systemic changes. And sometimes that means stepping outside of the therapy room and volunteering in low-income communities, maybe interviewing counselors from different socioeconomic status contexts, or attending trainings on class issues. These aren't extras. They're essential to becoming a truly multicultural, competent counselor. So let's look at a case study here. You're in your first semester of an internship, and your fellow intern is sharing his experience working with outpatient clients in a hospital setting. He says that overall things have gone well, but he's feeling stuck with his most recent client. All of his other clients have been able to talk about their feelings, and they've responded to his empathetic, person-centered interventions until this woman. And no matter how much he encourages her to share her feelings, she just won't open up emotionally. He knows she has to be stressed and needing an emotional outlet because of her circumstances. She's due to deliver her fourth child and is living in a shelter after leaving her abusive boyfriend. She also mentions that she is required to come to counseling in order to continue to receive food stamps and housing assistance. So, why do you think your fellow intern feels stuck? What do you imagine the client is experiencing in her interactions with this intern? Describe the worldview of the intern and how he's conceptualizing the client's issues. And based on what you've learned so far in this lesson, what suggestions might you have? What would you identify as the client's short and long-term counseling needs? How might this intern become more effective in helping her meet these needs? How could you advocate for this client? So take the time to reflect on that in your notebook. And we know counseling is not just about sitting in the office. It's also about advocacy. So let's kind of focus on some ways that we can act on what we've learned. One is going to be integrated services. So we want to partner with community agencies so clients get holistic support. We want to make sure that we're staying educated on poverty and class issues through trainings. We want to contribute to knowledge about class and mental health through research. We also want to connect clients with food banks and housing support or job programs to help them meet their basic needs. And we want to help clients find their own voices and strengths through empowerment. We want to get involved in initiatives like universal health care or living wage campaigns through policy advocacy. Even the small steps are going to matter. So, for example, simply just normalizing conversations about money in therapy can be revolutionary for clients who carry shame about their own financial struggles. And when we help clients advocate for themselves in the school or their workplace or their courtrooms, we're going to multiply the impact of our counseling. So let's look at a real world example here of James and the anger management referral. James is a 36-year-old white male referred to your agency by the court after a domestic violence incident. The incident involved his wife of 5 years and occurred in front of their two small children, ages 4 and 6. And the court is requiring anger management classes and individual counseling with duration to be determined by the agency. In other words, you. And if James fails to comply and participate fully, or if he commits further violence, he's going to go to jail. So James is assigned to your caseload, and you read the intake report prior to your first session. And that report indicates that James has another child from a previous marriage and is also facing charges for failure to pay child support. And it states that James is currently unemployed and that he tested positive for alcohol when he was picked up by the police. So what thoughts and feelings are coming up for you as you're reading that report and preparing to meet with James? Take a moment to pause here and write your answers down in your workbook. Now, let's go on to part 2 here. During your first session with James, he presents as defiant and tight-lipped, but then gradually lets down his guard as you're discussing the recent local high school football game. And you admit your ignorance of game strategy, which gives James a chance to reveal his expertise. And it kind of somewhat diffuses the power differential between you two. Because remember, you and your agency are deciding how much counseling he has to do to stay out of jail. And eventually, James explains that the domestic violence incident happened after he lost his manufacturing job of 15 years due to downsizing. And you remember what you learned about the importance of assessing for class-related issues and kind of decide to explore his values and his beliefs about class and gender roles and the meanings that he assigns to work. And then he reveals that his wife went out and got a job without telling him. And his shame became unbearable and he lashed out at her, resulting in the domestic violence charge. And he states that that he's never hit her before and that he's afraid of what this event has done to his relationship and his wife and his children. And James tells you that unless he secures a regular paycheck soon, his family's going to become homeless. And James handles all the family finances, and he has not shared their precarious position with his wife. And so he's frustrated that the schedule of the anger management classes prevents him from applying for this one job that's immediately available, which is night shift at another plant. And when you ask, James, how is he coping with these stressors? He tells you that he feels trapped. And the only thing that helps relieve the stress has been spending time at the bar with his buddies. So what is the presenting concern according to the court? And then what is the presenting concern according to James? And what is it according to you? Is the court mandated treatment adequate and sufficient to address the presenting concerns? And do you feel prepared and competent to be effective with this client? Think about why or why not. And how might a traditional counselor intervene? And how might an advocacy-oriented counselor intervene? What would you want to accomplish in your next few sessions with James? This case here grounds our theory in real counseling dilemmas. So there is a handout in your handbook. It's called Resources for Learning and Advocacy. And it is organized into social justice resources, resources for children, poverty, hunger, and homelessness, healthcare resources, etc. So you can add your own resources in the blank spaces provided. Write down any community agencies, nonprofits, or advocacy groups that you can connect your clients with in your own area. Building this personalized resource bank is a part of your responsibility as an advocate. Advocates are made, they're not born. The personal stories of social advocates often reveal that their commitment to addressing oppression and injustice grew out of personal experiences or relationships and challenges. And advocacy is a developmental process, moving naturally from awareness to action. So advocacy is a collective response to social injustice. We're empowering a client to speak up at a child custody hearing. That's necessary as it's as necessary as contacting a state senator or leading community education workshops. Advocacy is a normal and necessary element of a counselor's job. And we need to look at the professional level. That's going to be some integrated services. So like pilot studies of programs that are employing interagency collaborations and trainings. And those are going to include consumers in program design and have demonstrated significant improvements in treatment outcomes. These services are going to advocate for increased communication between the work setting and the client and the referring agencies and community service organizations. And we also need to look into like counselor training, encourage greater inclusiveness of class issues in counselor training and education. Suggestions include maybe the development of service learning programs or justice-oriented research and evaluating those training programs' ability to support poor and working class students. We also need more research, so participate in or initiate research that moves away from defining poverty overtly or covertly as like an individual problem by examining some social perceptions and socio-political structures that perpetuate poverty. Learn more about the research methods that include participants in identifying research questions, as well as in the research design and the data interpretation. On the individual level, we need to attend to basic needs of the clients, focus on empowerment, education and training, and do some advocacy in schools. And then at the socio-political level, we can work on public policy by contacting local, state, and regional professional organizations for counselors and ask about the past and the current and the pending advocacy efforts related to class issues. ACA, the National Board for Certified Counselors, the American School Counselor Association, and GACA and other professional counseling organizations provide current information on legislative issues on their websites, along with suggested actions. And we can also advocate for universal health insurance, like join the effort to ensure access to quality health care for everyone. Educate others about the connection between healthcare and mental health issues. And even at a client level, we can still advocate for our clients to get healthcare services. So making sure that we connect them with a case manager to help them, or even us stepping outside of that typical counselor role and helping the client to sign up for healthcare services that they can afford.